Hey, welcome back, Faithful Politics listeners and viewers. If you're watching us on our YouTube channel, I am your political host, Will Wright, and Josh can't be here with us today. He's off doing Josh things. So in his place, we have with us Professor or Dr. Constanza Musu, who is yes, nailed it. Who's an associate professor at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa, and editor-in-chief of the journal International Politics. She's been a consultant for the Military Center for Strategic Studies, Center for Advanced Defense Studies, the think tank of the Italian Ministry of Defense. She has published extensively on Western policies towards the Middle East, and we are just delighted to have her on today to help us understand kind of what's going on in Israel currently. So welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I guess just, first question, easy softball. Why did you choose to be in this field that you're in? Was there like some precipitating event that caused you to, want to study what's going on across the pond in the Middle East?
For me, it was maybe less of across the pond when I started, because I started work on the subject when I was doing my PhD, which I did in the UK. And even before then, when I did my first degree in history of political thought, which I did in Italy. So obviously all the links between Europe and, certainly Britain and the region are so important and so pervasive. It's also, of course, that was a great interest for me. And it's also a topic that I find more than many others just raises emotions on a level that maybe other equally complicated and difficult conflict doesn't. It seems like everybody wants to have an opinion about it, regardless of how much they know about it. And I thought, well, I should know more about it before I form my own opinion.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate people that know more than I do, which is a lot of people. So it just gives me
for everyone about any topic, right? So we can
yes.
never know everything.
Yes. I guess with everything going on in Israel, maybe do some level setting, set the stage for, what the heck is going on over there. And maybe I'll do a little stage setting myself. So a couple days ago, we had a group called Hamas that, unleashed this attack on Israel, killing a number of people. I'm currently in America. They just released reports saying that were like 22 people that possibly were killed. You're in Canada currently right now. I haven't heard a report about how many Canadians, if any, were taken. So maybe you can kind of.
We're Canadians too. Yes.
Oh,
yes.
Man. Yeah. So help us understand, like, what the heck is happening over there and why is it happening?
Well, what happened is that there are two sides to this.
Mm-hmm.
What happened in the past few days, and then what happened in a context that is much wider and longer than just this last few days, right? Mm-hmm. So to answer your first question, what happened? What happened is that this group called Hamas, which is you could say a spin-off of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a group that was created that was born out of Egypt almost a century ago. This group, Hamas, has ruled over this very narrow strip of land called the Gaza Strip. And they have been in charge of this strip of land since 2007. This is, a wider conversation, let's say. But they are sworn enemies of Israel, and in their charter, is the destruction of the state of Israel as one of the stated purposes of the organization. In the early hours of Saturday, this group basically started an offensive against the communities alongside the border between the Gaza Strip and Israel. Now, this border is not just a normal border in the sense that it's completely fenced in with the physical fence and very sophisticated electronic defenses. And it looks like from what we have heard and seen, even including with drones and satellite images and journalists on the ground, that a large number of Hamas terrorists have breached this barrier. Some of them physically breached the barrier. Some even came onto the Israeli side using paragliders and, flew into Israel. Others, as I say, came through the fence, which was partly bulldozed and disabled, and entered nearby communities that were maybe 1, 2, 5 kilometers distance from the fence. And they systematically killed or kidnapped anyone in their path, including a large number of people, estimated at around 260, 300 people at a rave concert, a techno music concert that was taking place nearby. In small rural communities, in many cases surprising people in their homes, hiding in their homes and killing, as I said, systematically, or kidnapping. And we've seen some disconcerting images also of people being kidnapped and transported back into the Gaza Strip on any kind of transportation, including motorcycles and golf carts. We know that there are now between 100 and 150 people being held hostages inside the Gaza Strip, including Americans and many other nationalities.
Got it. So what's kind of the historical backdrop for why Hamas is, attacking Israel? Because I definitely think, just reading, people's opinions about it through social media, and sort of tying into what you're saying earlier about, there's a lot of confusion about what's happening over there, and it's not necessarily so black and white. So maybe help us understand kind of what that gray area is, and why Hamas is precipitating this attack.
Well, first of all, let me say something about your last point. Why is Hamas is precipitating this attack? I don't really have an answer for that. I don't think anyone does at this stage, because the attack that they've conducted is so brutal, so sudden, and with such a use of resources, rocket missiles and fighters entering and weaponry, that it was sure to cause a massive reaction on the part of Israel. So you would then ask, what is the purpose of this? What is it to win something, or to provoke Israel into a massive retaliation, to precipitate a conflict, to maybe conflagrate an entire regional conflict in which other countries become involved? We don't know. I've heard, many experts wondering what is the end game. Ultimately also wondering, is the end game the interest of the Palestinians, or is there some other game at play that it's certainly not in the interest of the residents of Gaza, who are now under heavy bombardment? So this is, on the immediate. Now the bigger question, where to begin?
Maybe I don't know, early 1900s, if that's not too far back.
It's actually where I start normally when I talk with my students. I say many people try to form an opinion about what is happening today, or even what has happened in the past few years. But the reality is that it's impossible to understand this conflict without understanding the roots of it. And some of the roots are the beginning of the past century, so the beginning of the 20th century. Some are at the end of the 19th century. Some of them are at biblical times. So I think I'm gonna skip the biblical times.
That's fine. It's probably good.
Yes. So let's say that the great tragedy of this conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians is that we are in the presence of two people with a common history and a common heritage, and separately, obviously. Some of it common, though. Common because they also coexisted. But we have a people, the Jews, who recognize themselves as who are a coherent people who wanted to find self-determination, political self-determination, and to have a country to be their own. And the Palestinians, in that respect, are a mirror image, because they are also people who is seeking self-determination, political self-determination. And the tragedy of this is that they are both seeking self-determination in a very tiny space that is incredibly charged in terms of its significance for the three large monotheistic religions. So for Judaism, for Christianity, and for Islam. And where the significance of every square kilometer, it's all a stratification of this history. So this is our premise, and it doesn't bode well already, I think, for a clear delineation of what happens. So of course, we probably all know the word diaspora. Diaspora, it's the spreading of a people from their land of origin, and there has been a diaspora of Jews since their expulsion from the historical side of the Kingdom of Israel. And if we want to kind of fast forward to the late 19th century, there is a growing, at the end of the 1800s, there is a growing sense of a national identity, and the idea that the Jews should be entitled to have, to determine their political future and their destiny. And this is the birth of what we call today Zionism, which essentially is Jewish nationalism intended in a very literal sense, right? So the desire of Jews to have a state. And already in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, Jews started immigrating from Europe, from North America, from elsewhere, into historical Palestine, which is the land from whence they came before they were dispersed in the diaspora. Now, this land was not empty, though. And here lies the tragedy. This land was not empty because Palestinians had been living in that land, as well as a small community of religious Jews who were also living in that land, especially around Jerusalem. But obviously the Arab community was much bigger numerically. The majority of Jews were no longer in historical Palestine. Now, who was ruling over there? And this is the question. Was it the Palestinians who were ruling over there? It wasn't the Palestinians who were ruling over there, and it wasn't the Jews who were ruling over there. It was the Ottomans. It was the Ottoman Empire who was ruling there. And so we have a situation in which Palestinians were working the land they did not own the land in large part because they were working the land that was owned by absentee landlords who were Ottomans and did not live necessarily there. And then you have Jews who started to arrive and started to either buying some of the land or cultivating some of the land or acquiring some of the land. This is all, extremely complicated. So all this immigration already started at the beginning, late 1800, early 1900.
Can I ask you just one question? And maybe you're going to get to this, but so when you look at a map and you look at what the borders are of Israel, and Israel kind of looks like this weird isosceles triangle turned to the side, and you've got like Jordan, I think, to the north, and Lebanon to the north, Jordan, I believe, to the east, and Egypt to the south. Is the in Syria? Yeah. So like were the borders kind of the same at the time that Palestinians occupy that land?
No, this is a construct. Okay. It's something that was literally drawn in 1947 and then in 1949. But when, at the time that I was describing, the early 20th century, this was all part of the Ottoman Empire. So there was nothing that resembles the map that we look at today. After the fall of the Ottoman Empire, then we have Britain, who's ruling over this land. And again, here I'm really, kind of summarizing and skipping over so much history. And at the time, as a mandate power, Britain started looking into this idea that the land should possibly be divided, and that there should maybe be a partition plan and the creation of possibly two states, right? So we already see this embryonic idea of a partition of Palestine, and maybe the establishment of a Jewish state alongside an Arab state already before World War II. Now, with World War II, as we know, we have 6 million Jews killed in the Holocaust, and there was an increased push towards finding a political solution for the plight of the Jews. Now, the idea of Israel, though, had to be pre-existing for this to be considered, right? And this is why I started from before. So the idea of creating and the immigration to Israel already had started before. Essentially after the war, after the Second World War, there was, a push for, first the British mandate finished, and then there was a push of the United Nations, to create a state, sovereign independent state. However, the United Nations also wanted to create an Arab state. And so there was, in 1947, a partition plan. Now, why am I talking about all this? The reason I'm talking about all this is because a lot of those claims and grievances are very present still today. So you will hear, even in negotiation and in political speeches today, in 2023, you will hear references to the partition plan. So what is this partition plan? It's like, what are we talking about? That, how do we come up with that triangle that you're talking about? Mm-hmm. And so in 1947, the UN basically drew a map of what could become two states, an Arab state and the state of Israel. Now, question, who's representing the interest of what eventually became the Israelis, and who's representing the Palestinians? Now, on the one hand, you have the representation, the political representation of the Jews already living and also in the process of immigrating to Palestine, which was the World Zionist Organization, and as well as the government of the community of Jews that already existed at that point we're talking 47, so they've been immigrating with varied, level of immigration since the late 18th century. And then you have the Palestinians, but the Palestinians did not have independent political representation. So there wasn't really a full political independent Palestinian position. Rather, there were neighboring Arab states that represented the Palestinians. Now, what did the Arabs think about this idea of creating a state of Israel? Their view already back then was creating a state of Israel was unacceptable, because the creation of a state of Israel was a way to make the Arabs pay for the sins of the European. This is a big argument, and is still very, very strong today. Now, the Israeli counter-argument is that the link between the Jews and the land of Palestine, of historical Palestine, transcends anything to do with the Second World War, anything to do with the Holocaust, and it's an ancient link that is rooted in biblical times, right? So we have
it was given to them by God,
yes,
right?
and so it's really two completely different arguments and different perspectives, and even those those Jews who don't necessarily give a biblical explanation, so the land being given by God, but rather give a more, let's say, a more secular explanation, they will talk about the historical link with the land and the presence and the significance of the land, so that this is not just a piece of land, there is a link. Now, the problem is that what happened, and this is something as a major point of contention still today between Israelis and Palestinians, is that the Jewish authorities accepted the partition resolution, and the Arab states and the Arab leaders rejected it. So what that map, and anyone can Google it and find partition resolution 1947, that map basically never really was implemented. It never came to be, because what happened was that the Israelis or the Jewish authorities declared independence in May of 1948, but immediately neighboring Arab states declared war on the newly created state of Israel. And their view was that this is an unacceptable intrusion in land that should be Arab land, and Jews can live there if they want, and they can conduct their business. And they even, pointed out that to the fact that Jews had historically lived in many Muslim countries peacefully and had better status, better conditions than they did in many Christian countries, right? So, the argument was there cannot be a state of Israel, a Jewish majority state of Israel. There has to be an Arab state where Jews can live. They're welcome to live here, but if it's going to be an Arab state, then immigration is going to be regulated by Arab authorities and not by a Jewish state. So, you see, this is the start. And so how does it start? They start with a war. It started with a war that lasted between 48 and 49. It ended in 49. And we're getting to that triangular shape that you're talking about. Ended in 49 with Israel controlling more land that it was given to them by the 47 partition plan. Okay, so the land, as one can find on a map, was was more for the Arab states than the armistice line in 49. However, those pieces of lands that we hear a lot about, especially in the last few days, namely the West Bank and Gaza, they were not under Israeli control at that point. They ended up under Jordanian control, the West Bank, and under Egyptian control, the Gaza Strip. And they remain under the Jordanian and Egyptian control, respectively, for 20 years. So from, a little under 20 years, for 18 years, from 1949 to 1967. Now, what happened during those years was that the Jordanians declared annexation of the West Bank and gave and basically declared that the West Bank was part of Jordan, while the Egyptian never annexed the Gaza Strip. Now, this annexation was not recognized. Only 2 countries recognized this annexation, but internationally it was not accepted. But the Jordanians did declare the annexation, at least on the face of it, while the Egyptian never did, and kept the Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip as refugees under their control. All the Arabs that stayed inside what we consider today Israel proper became Israeli citizens. And so this is how, if we look at the Israeli population of today, we have 20% of Arab population. So 20% of the population of Israel is composed of Arabs, not Jews.
And those Arabs live primarily Gaza and West Bank.
No. Those were the ones that actually stayed inside what we consider Israel proper.
Got it. Okay.
Here is the trick to the whole thing. So there was this war between 48 and 49. And as I said, Israel ended up controlling more land, but Jordan controlled the West Bank and Egypt controlled the Gaza Strip. Where were the Palestinians? Okay, so this is going to answer your question. So during this war between 48 and 49, this is the war to which the Palestinians refer as the Nakba, the catastrophe. A large number of Palestinians, some, the numbers are not, the census was not that detailed, but we're talking about as many as 700,000, were either left voluntarily or were pushed away, were evicted, were forced out, or left their lands that they had held for generations inside of what was Israel. Where did they go? They went to the West Bank, a lot of them, and they went to Gaza. They also went to other neighboring Arab countries. Okay, so that's why we have Palestinians in many neighboring Arab countries. Part of this Palestinians, though, remain inside Israel. Now, those who remain inside Israel are today Israeli citizens. So 20% of the Israeli population today is Arab. They have Israeli passports, they have, Israeli healthcare, they vote in Israeli elections, etc. Although their status, many argue that they have less rights than other component of Israeli society, namely the Jewish component of Israeli society, but that's another conversation. Important, but a different one. And then and this is, a map was drawn on a piece of paper of this kind of armistice line at the end of this war. And this map was drawn with a green pen. And so there was a green line that delineated the new borders of Israel. And this is the map to which we refer in 2023 when we talk about the green line. This is an expression that you will hear, the green line. And basically it's the armistice line of 1949. At this point, Israel is bigger than it was on the original map, but it does not control the West Bank and Gaza Strip yet. Those are under Jordanian and Egyptian control.
Got it. The green line reference is kind of interesting because, like, you're saying it actually links back to an actual green pen that was used. Like, is that true?
To my knowledge, it is true. Yes.
Okay. Well, cool. Like that's just like an interesting, I don't know, Easter egg in this whole thing. So, okay. Now, how do some of these terms or, you know, accords that we've heard of sort of change or attempt to change like what's happened? So like the Oslo Accords, for instance. Unpack that.
Yeah.
First.
So in order to understand the Oslo Accord, we need to remember that, you know, as I say, the West Bank was under Jordanian control and the Gaza Strip under Egyptian control. This changes in 1967. So in 1967, there is another war, yet another war. And at the end of this war, Israel has entered the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, which are disputed with Syria, disputed or occupied from Syria, and the Sinai Peninsula. So Israel controls physically, was present physically in these areas since 1967. It then gives back the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, but maintains control over the West Bank and Gaza. So you are talking about the Oslo process, right? So at this point, the situation is that Israel, all of a sudden, it's in control of those areas, the West Bank and Gaza. And originally, that was not the plan. The plan was never to become, permanently in charge of this area. And, ultimately, they pose a huge challenge, right? An administrative challenge, a legal challenge, a humanitarian challenge, a military challenge, all level of complexity, right? On the other hand, a portion of the Israeli population does want to maintain control over those territories, but not all of them. Not all of them. Now, at this point, though, the Israelis are in charge, and the Palestinians are, start pushing for their own independence. You know, they want to gain independence. They want to have a state, even if it's not going to be a state on as much land as would have been given to them by the original United Nations resolution. They still want to have a state on the West Bank and Gaza. And they have a leadership, controversial leadership, again, another conversation, a separate one, that starts negotiating with Israel. And eventually those negotiations that started in Oslo, which is why it's called the Oslo process, lead to an agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. And this Oslo process essentially kind of lays out a series of steps that would eventually transfer responsibilities and government responsibilities from the Israelis to the Palestinians over a period of time. Right. So this is the so-called Oslo process. And it's important to separate that from relationships that Israel has with other Arab states. Right? Because there is an Israeli Arab process. So Israel and Lebanon, Israel and Syria, Israel, Egypt, etc. And then there is an Israeli-Palestinian question. Right? So one is between two sovereign states, two or more sovereign states, and one is between Israel and the Palestinian aspiring to become a state. Right? So you could argue there is an imbalance, right, between a sovereign state and, a people that does not have a state negotiating. Right? So this is one of the complexity. Would you like me to narrow down something specifically? Because there's so much.
Oh. No, I mean, I'm just blown away because, this is one of those like global issues. I mean, so I'm an American, right? And most Americans don't follow global affairs because like we just don't. I mean, like when it comes to Ukraine, Russia, got it. I can talk pretty intelligently about like the Maidan Revolution and about like how the annexation of Crimea sort of took place. But like when it comes to the Middle East, like I don't really know a lot, and I've been there. I spent a year in Iraq and spent some time in Saudi Arabia, and just was unfamiliar. So I really appreciate you I don't know, dumbing it down for me a little bit so that way I can understand it. But
down at all. I was actually just trying to extract important things, but
yeah. Can we switch to just who Hamas is? Because based on my reading, like Hamas isn't necessarily representative of all Palestinians, correct?
I think you are 100% correct. Hamas is, was born as a spin-off of the Muslim Brotherhood. And it's an organization that is Islamic in nature, so kind of sees an overlap of political and religious life, essentially. It does rule by Sharia law, and this is the vision that they have for a Palestinian state. It would be a state that is based on Sharia law as a form of governance. Hamas was, initially mostly focused on social action. So offering a space for Palestinian youth, impoverished, with less opportunities for education, healthcare, even things to do, to kind of, learn and, be somehow coalesce around values. And it was immediately a big rival to the authority and the rule of the main party, the main Palestinian party, Fatah, of which Yasser Arafat was, the president of the Palestinian Authority for a long time until his death. To the point that, following the principle that my enemy's enemy is my friend, at the beginning, Israel actually supported Hamas to a degree and let it operate. So this is not something totally new, the Americans did that with the Taliban too, as we know.
It's true.
So it's not new. I mean, it's a classic dynamic where, you're trying to divide and conquer, and, the government of Israel, what had the enmity with the Yasser Arafat and with Fatah, and they wanted to, undermine their authority, supporting the authority of another entity that might undermine them. So it's important, to underline the point that you made. Do they represent all Palestinians? I don't think they do, and I'm not saying that just because, I am saying this as as a university professor. There have been surveys conducted, and the Palestinian public opinion, like any public opinion, is divided, right? And often there are also issues surrounding how well those who are in power perform. And so sometimes people also support some groups as a way of punishing others, the same way that sometimes more than a party winning the election is another party that's losing the election. Really, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. So is Hamas like a political party?
Well, it
Is that
has
like a good
become
way to?
so what happened is that in 2006 there were political elections in the Palestinian territories. And those elections were actually supervised by the international community. There were monitors, everything to ensure that those were free and fair elections. And while Hamas run in a unitary fashion, against Hamas, Fatah and other Palestinian politicians kind of fragmented in different, parties and smaller groupings. And what happened is that ultimately, to the surprise of anyone who did not know Palestinian politics in great detail, Hamas won. Partly as a result of the fragmentation of the opposition, which of course, it's something that we can see in the politics of any country. And partly also because Fatah, the Palestinian public opinion was a little tired of corruption, of people who were hanging on to power, who might have been pocketing international aid for their own interests. People seeing some politician having big houses and big cars while they live in poverty, and what do you have on the other side? Well, an organization that is basically pushing an idea of purity, of a cause, of unity. Now, following this election, however, basically we have almost a civil war between different Palestinian factions. And this is how, in 2023, today, we can see that the Palestinians and the Palestinian territories are physically and politically split. The West Bank and the Gaza Strip are not adjacent. They are physically separated. Right? So there's been talks of building a road to connect the two, et cetera, as part of the talks about peace, but they are not physically connected, and they are now politically separated, and they have been since 2007. Hamas rules over the Gaza Strip, while the Palestinian Authority rules over the West Bank. Now, what is the big problem is that Hamas, in its charter, in its founding charter, has as a purpose the destruction of the state of Israel, the elimination of the state of Israel. And it has chosen also as a, like a tactical, and you could argue also strategic choice to use terrorism as a means to their political end. And certainly this is what we've seen in the last few days. So the United States, Canada, large part of the European Union, they all designate Hamas as a terrorist organization. So they rule over 2 million Palestinians and an important portion of the Palestinian territory, but they're a terrorist organization. And so they cannot officially be part of any, nor do they want to, but it's also, impossible for diplomats, for example, to be seen as having a dialogue with Hamas because they are a terrorist organization.
That's weird. I mean, it would be like in my mind, the equivalent of Americans classifying Republicans or Democrats as like a terrorist organization, which I could see would make things pretty difficult to try to run a country if you're a Palestinian, I'd imagine, right?
I mean, yes. Obviously, Hamas has been responsible for countless terror attacks. So I don't want to make, a comparison with indicating the Republicans or Democrats as terrorists. But for example, some have made the comparison with ISIS. ISIS has, at the apex of its strength, it was actually controlling a large amount of land, and you former military, and I think you do very well that they should documents and a currency, and they had an anthem and a flag. But this is not a completely unknown situation. I mean, we also have Hezbollah, that's designated a terror organization, and it's part of a government that we recognize, Lebanon. So it's a component of it. It's not the first time that we have a situation in which we're faced with that kind of dilemma.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit more about Hezbollah? Like what's their motivation for getting involved or potentially getting involved with this conflict?
So Hezbollah, it's again a combination party, militia, terror organization. It's so many labels. That is based in Lebanon. And as you said, I think at the beginning of this conversation, you remarked that there have been exchanges of fire at the northern border of Israel, so the border with the south of Lebanon. What would be their interest in getting involved? Hezbollah has had already a number of conflicts with Israel. And Hezbollah, as well as Hamas, are both funded and armed, at least partially, by Iran. And Hezbollah is another sworn enemy of Israel. Now, this opens up a whole other conversation about, the war of Israel and Lebanon, the 2006 Israel-Lebanese conflict, and the withdrawal of Israel from Lebanon. But I would say that in order to understand why other actors might get involved, we have to understand the whole regional context. Who has an interest in this spiraling out? And in order to understand that, we have to understand the regional and global ambition of Iran. And this is it's necessary to understand that, because otherwise we don't understand how all these actors connect, because they don't always seem to, make sense together. They make for very strange allies. And very often the principle followed is not that of a commonality of interest, but a commonality of enemies that brings together different parties. So, in the lead up to the weekend tragedy in Israel, Israel had been for a long time under the sponsorship or with the support of the United States, had been in dialogue with Saudi Arabia to normalize relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Now, there is no real sympathy between Saudi Arabia and Israel. However, Saudi Arabia sees itself as a very important actor, a representative of Arab interests in the region, and it certainly sees the benefit of having peace with Israel, especially as in the context of containing Iranian influence in the region. So again, my enemy's enemy is my friend. And so one of the immediate possible impacted processes by what happened might be exactly this kind of, dialogue that is open between Israel and Saudi Arabia, while, Iran benefits possibly from this. I mean, I say possibly, but really I shouldn't say possibly. The Iranians celebrated yesterday, and officially celebrated the the Hamas incursion into Israeli territory. So why would Hezbollah get involved? Well, the interests of Hezbollah might be theirs, but also a projection of the interests of Iran, and maintaining more fronts open obviously diverts attention. So not only Hezbollah, but also Syria appears to have has engaged in some skirmishes. Now, it's interesting though, and I think we'll only see that in the next days, right? So we don't have an answer for that now, are these countries really going to get involved, or are they posturing to show some kind of support, but then they're not really gonna spiral out of control? But it's this support or exchange then will be rapidly kind of contained, right? The Americans have sent one of the largest, if not the largest, you can probably tell me, aircraft carrier there, and they've declared very clearly that it's not there to get involved, it's there to deter other actors. So you have the American deterrent, you have the Israeli deterrent as well, because they are also moving troops to those borders. Posturing, it's a big part of politics, not just in the Middle East, everywhere, I would argue. Certainly in the Middle East, it's a big part of it. Arab state public opinions are outraged when they see, obviously, and so are Western public opinion when they see, civilian Palestinians victims of bombardments. Can they limit their involvement by A, posturing politically, and B, kind of at least making a gesture of some level of, disturbance? We don't know yet, right? We don't know yet, but certainly something to monitor, because it's not obvious that they want or they are prepared to go all into an all complete war on all fronts.
Yeah, that makes sense. Gosh, so I want to be respectful of your time. I think I literally asked you like 3 questions, and I have like a lot more, but maybe that's just an excuse for us to invite you back. But I want to get your thoughts, because as this conflict unfolds, I think a lot of people's knowledge or lack thereof, or misconceptions and biases are all going to kind of kick into overdrive. So I'd love to kind of get your thoughts about like what are some misconceptions or biases that people commonly, get wrong when they think about, the Middle East conflict, specifically with Israel and Palestine.
I'm an academic. So for me, the answer to misconception, it's always more knowledge. And this is what I tell my students in the class. I do teach courses on the conflict, and I say, you might have your own opinions, and I want you to have your own opinions, but I want you to be able to articulate your opinions based on an understanding of the whole situation. And unfortunately, that implies a lot of reading and a lot of understanding of, all those entrenched grievances. And the complications of international affairs. When we say, does the United States always offer unqualified support to Israel? Well, that's not true. U.S. support for Israel has been expressed by President Biden as being, very strong, and that, Israel has a right to self-defense. But it is not true to say that the U.S. have been always supportive of Israel and every choice that Israel has made. In fact, this very administration has very tense and difficult relations with Netanyahu in many other respects. So, those big blanket statements about, one side is always wrong or the other side made
Mm.
this and this is what, unfortunately for this conflict, I remember once someone saying to me, an historian actually saying to me, many countries' conflicts are written in books, but only this conflict is written in the book. As it starts in the book.
Oh, that's deep.
Yes. And his name was like, you need to start from the book and then you make your way, down 5,000 years of history or, close to 6,000. And so this is really the only antidote to any kind of, as it often is, right? So knowledge is what you need in order to be able to make an intelligent contribution to any debate. And then you have your opinion, but opinion has to come in top of knowledge, not on top of air.
Yeah. So speaking of books, like what are your recommendations for, somebody that is interested in what's going on over there, but, doesn't really know a whole lot and wants to, kind of have a companion reading guide after they listen to this podcast?
I quite like for my students a book by Alan Doughty called Israel Palestine. And the reason I like it is that it's many books, try to offer mostly all the factual analysis of what happens. And this book instead tries to kind of group events in a kind of conceptual framework. So all, a certain phase of the conflict. So the phase of Israel and Arab states, and then the Israel-Palestine phase and how they are. So it tries to kind of take important issues and group them together to guide the reader in understanding phases. And it still leaves you open to forming your own opinion ultimately, right? Which is kind of what you want. And then there is another one that I like, actually the complete title escapes me right now. I can find it somewhere in my
it's
bookshelf there.
Yeah, if you email it to me, I'll put it in the show notes so that way people have access to it.
But it's a book that basically looks at the discourse and different understandings. So every single event and what is the Israeli point of view and what is the Palestinian point of view or the Arab point of view. So different perspectives. So again, to show how the same event, I can tell you one event and then we can have a completely different interpretation of the same exact event from the two sides without changing the facts. It's just an interpretation.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, Professor Musu, thank you so much. This was super educational for me. I really appreciate your time.
I appreciate your time and thank you for listening.
Thank you. And to our listeners, we will see you next week. Take care. Bye-bye.